In the entire history of the National Park Service, over 150 years of protecting America's wilderness, only one ranger has ever vanished and never been found. Not his body, not his uniform, not a single thread of fabric, a single bone fragment, a single piece of evidence that he ever existed at all. His name was Paul Fugate, and on January 13th, 1980, he walked out of a visitor center in southeastern Arizona into a landscape he knew better than anyone alive, and simply ceased to exist. But there's a detail about this case that has never made it into the official reports. A detail that a fellow ranger named Bill Murray has carried with him for over 4 decades. Roughly 1 month before Paul disappeared, he walked over to Murray's cabin and handed him something unexpected: an M14 automatic rifle. No explanation, no context, just the weapon, passed from one man to another, like someone settling accounts before a long journey. Murray never told the investigators about it, but he says he thinks about it all the time. What did Paul know? What was he preparing for? And why did he give away a rifle when perhaps he should have kept it? To understand what happened to Paul Fugate, you first need to understand where it happened. And the Chiricahua National Monument is not like any place you've ever been. The Chiricahua Mountains rise from the Sonoran desert floor like islands from a vast, dry ocean. Scientists call them sky islands, isolated, ranges that climb over 5,000 feet above the surrounding grasslands, creating ecosystems that exist nowhere else on Earth. The air at the base is hot, dry, filled with mesquite and cactus. But as you climb, the desert gives way to oak, to juniper, to pine forests that feel transplanted from another continent entirely. 27 million years ago, a volcano erupted here with a force 1,000 times greater than Mount St. Helens. The superheated ash fused into a rock called rhyolite tuff, and over the millennia, wind and water carved it into something that defies description. Massive stone pillars, balanced rocks that seem to defy gravity, towering hoodoos that look like the ruins of a civilization that never existed. The Apache called these mountains home for centuries. Cochise, the legendary war chief, used their labyrinthine canyons as a stronghold during his long conflict with the United States Army. If you stand at Masai Point on a clear day and look toward the Dragoon Mountains in the distance, you can see a rock formation that looks exactly like the profile of a strong Apache face, staring forever toward the horizon. Nobody carved it. It simply appeared, shaped by the same patient erosion that created everything else in this strange and ancient place. This is a landscape of secrets, of hidden canyons and sheer drops, of arroyos and barrancas that swallow sound and light. The monument covers 12,000 acres, but it feels infinite. A man could walk into these rocks and simply disappear. And that's exactly what Paul Fugate did. Paul Braxton Fugate was born on September 2nd, 1938 in Texas. He grew up with 5 siblings in a close-knit family, the kind of man who collected knowledge the way other people collect possessions. He studied biology in college, graduating in 1963, and briefly considered working at Dugway Proving Ground, a secretive Army research facility. But something about the idea didn't sit right with him. Instead, he chose the National Park Service, a life dedicated not to destruction, but to preservation, to understanding the natural world and sharing that understanding with others. He married Dodie on December 11th, 1964, and 5 months later, They moved to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Then came the Navajo National Monument in Arizona, home of the ancient Betatacan cliff dwelling. But Paul had a problem. He was, by all accounts, a rebel. At 41, he had a Texas twang, blue eyes, a woolly brown beard, and a ponytail that ran to his shoulders in open defiance of his superiors. He was known to embrace a countercultural lifestyle that didn't sit well with the establishment. He chafed against the buttoned-down Park Service culture of that era. "Give 'em a bad time" was the Fugate family mantra, and Paul lived by it. His superintendent at Navajo Monument once wrote to the regional director in frustration, "If you want to look and live like a hippie, that is certainly your prerogative, but not here." He added bitterly, "I do not understand the breed now coming into the NPS." In 1970, Paul was transferred to Chiricahua, and there, among the hoodoos and the silence, he found something like home. January 13th, 1980, was a Sunday. The off-season. Quiet. Paul was the only permanent staff member on duty that day. The only other person was a seasonal employee working as a clerk in the visitor center. At approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Paul told her he was going to check the nature trails leading toward Faraway Ranch, a 400-acre parcel of land that the Park Service had recently acquired. Faraway Ranch. The name itself sounds like something from a dream or a warning. Paul told the clerk that if he wasn't back by 4:30, she should close up without him. It was a casual instruction, the kind of thing a man says when he expects to return. He was wearing his green and gray Park Service uniform, the official NPS arrowhead patch on his upper shirt sleeve, a gold-colored ranger badge pinned over his heart. He walked toward the monument entrance, toward the trails he had walked 1,000 times before. He didn't take his radio. He didn't take his wallet. He didn't take the $300 in cash sitting in his cabin. He didn't take his pocket glass, the magnifying lens he used to examine plants. He didn't take any of the things a man would take if he were planning to leave his life behind. He just walked out the door, and no one ever saw him again. The search began within hours. At first, it was a standard missing person operation. Paul was experienced. He knew the terrain. Maybe he had twisted an ankle, gotten disoriented as the light faded. Searchers fanned out along the trails to Faraway Ranch, calling his name into the gathering darkness. Nothing. The next day, the operation expanded. The Cochise County Sheriff's Department joined. Then the Bureau of Land Management. Then the U.S. Forest Service. Tracking. Dogs were brought in, their noses pressed to the ground, searching for any trace of human scent. Helicopters circled overhead. Light planes flew grid patterns across the rugged terrain. 17 square miles were searched, meticulously, repeatedly. Volunteers combed the trails for years afterward, checking abandoned mines, off-trail areas, anywhere a body might have fallen or been hidden. They found nothing. No footprints. No fabric snagged on rocks or branches. No sign of a struggle. No blood. No bones. Not a single thread of his uniform. Not the arrowhead patch. Not the gold badge. It was as if Paul Fugate had walked into the rocks and been swallowed by the earth itself. But then something strange emerged. Some park employees reported seeing vehicle spin-out tracks on a primitive dirt road near Faraway Ranch. And more disturbing, there were indications of a scuffle in the dirt. Signs that something had happened, something violent. And then there was the witness, park acquaintance told investigators that he had seen something that afternoon, around 4 p.m., roughly 2 hours after Paul left the visitor center. A dark green pickup truck with a camper shell speeding out of the monument at high velocity, and in the cab, between two men he didn't recognize, was Paul Fugate, slumped, motionless. Investigators brought in a hypnotist to enhance the witness's memory. Under hypnosis, he described the scene in unsettling detail. Paul looked sad and dejected. The driver was in his 30s, with a Kenny Rogers-style beard, wearing a black, white, and red plaid shirt. The other man wore a green jacket. Perhaps, the witness speculated, the same green jacket Paul had worn when he left the visitor center. But there was a problem. The vehicles had passed each other at 50 miles per hour. A fleeting glimpse. A fraction of a second. Park Service officials dismissed the account. There was no corroborating evidence. No license plate number. No way to prove that the slumped figure was actually Paul. But the image lingered. A man in uniform, trapped between two strangers, being driven away from the place he loved. Sad, dejected, as if he already knew what was coming. To understand why this might have happened, you need to understand where Chiricahua sat in 1980. Cochise County shares 80 miles of border with Mexico. The Chiricahua Corridor had been a historic immigration route for undocumented farm workers for decades, but by 1980, something was changing. The corridor was being increasingly used by smugglers moving contraband across the border. Illegal activity occurred every day in the vicinity of the monument. Investigators developed a theory. Paul, wearing his ranger uniform with its gold badge glinting in the January sun, had stumbled upon something he wasn't supposed to see. A criminal operation, a smuggling route, men who couldn't afford to leave witnesses. But there was another possibility, one that some investigators found even more troubling. What if Paul hadn't stumbled onto something? What if he had been involved? What if something he was part of had gone wrong? Paul had connections that some considered questionable. The monument was remote, isolated, beyond the reach of prying eyes. Had he gotten in over his head? And then there was that rifle, the M14 he had given to Bill Murray a month before his disappearance. No explanation, no context, just a man giving away a weapon he might have needed. Did Paul know something was coming? Had he received a threat? Was he preparing for something? Or settling his affairs? In February 1981, just over a year after Paul vanished, the National Park Service made a decision that stunned his family and friends. They declared that Paul had voluntarily abandoned his post. They fired him, and they demanded that his wife Dodie return the $6,925 they had paid her during the time he was listed as missing, plus 11% interest. The regional chief detective told a reporter that he believed Paul was living somewhere healthy with someone new. Finding him, he said, was not a priority. Dodie fought back. She organized volunteer searches. She held benefit concerts. She badgered Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater until he got involved. Purported sightings trickled in from around the country. One turned out to be a mentally disabled man in New Mexico. Another was a shrimp fisherman in the Florida Keys. In 1983, someone reported seeing Paul in Bend, Oregon. None of the tips led anywhere. And then, in July 1983, a breakthrough, or what seemed like one. A Cochise County Sheriff's official announced that based on new leads, Paul had met a violent end, and that the arrest of more than one person was imminent. No one was ever arrested. No charges were ever filed. The leads, whatever they were, dissolved into the same silence that had swallowed Paul himself. In 1986, the Park Service finally commissioned a thorough review of the case. Pete Nye, one of the agency's top criminal investigators, spent a week going through every piece of paper, every witness statement, every search record. His conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. There was no evidence that Paul Fugate had walked away from his life. He had left behind his wallet, his money, his valuable gun collection, his expensive camera equipment, a truck he was restoring. He had left behind everything a man would take if he were planning to disappear. More than 8 years after his disappearance, without ever finding his body, Paul Fugate was declared dead. It is the only case of its kind in modern Park Service history. Other rangers have died in the wilderness. Some have taken years to find. But eventually, their remains surface. Eventually, the wilderness gives back what it has taken. Paul Fugate is different. The wilderness took him and kept him. Or something else did. Over the decades, investigators have chased shadows. Anonymous letters arrived, pointing fingers at inmates, at mysterious acquaintances, at a Tucson auto shop whose owner reacted strangely when questioned. A suspicious land purchase near the monument, made a month after Paul vanished, raised eyebrows but led nowhere. Tips came in about a Wisconsin man who allegedly made disturbing claims at a party about a law enforcement officer in Arizona in 1980. Nothing could be proven. Nothing could be connected. In 2014, a Park Service employee named Karen Gonzalez was violently attacked at Fairway Ranch by an alleged smuggler who had crossed the border. A reminder that the area Paul had walked into that January afternoon remained dangerous, remained lawless, remained beyond the reach of civilization. In 2018, the National Park Service announced it had discovered new information about the case. They tripled the reward to $60,000. But they never revealed what the new information was. And still, Paul Fugate has not been found. Today, the trails Paul walked are still open to the public. Thousands of visitors hike them every year, photographing the hoodoos, marveling at the balanced rocks, breathing the clean mountain air. Few of them know that somewhere along these paths, a ranger in a green and gray uniform walked into eternity. There is a small plaque at the monument now, dedicated to Paul's memory. Dodie still lives in New Mexico, in a creaky prefab on 7 acres of scrub outside Santa Fe. In her garage sits a Ford pickup with flat tires, the truck she and Paul drove home from the dealership in 1971. She never got rid of it. And somewhere, in a cabin or a garage or a forgotten drawer, Bill Murray still has that M14 rifle, the one Paul gave him a month before he vanished, the one he never told the investigators about. What did Paul know? What was he preparing for? Why did he give away a rifle when perhaps he should have kept it? The Chiricahua Mountains don't answer questions. They just stand there, patient and ancient, shaped by forces that predate humanity and will outlast it. 27 million years ago, a volcano created this landscape. The Apache used these canyons to hide from armies. And somewhere in the rocks, in the arroyos, in the barrancas, there may be an answer to what happened to Paul Fugate. Or there may not. Some questions are never answered. Some uniforms remain forever empty. If you know anything about the disappearance of Paul Fugate, the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch can be reached at 888-653-0009. 45 years later, someone is still waiting for the phone to ring. The reward stands at $60,000. But for Dodie Fugate, for Paul's family, for the colleagues who still remember him, the reward they're looking for can't be measured in money. They just want to know what happened to the man who walked into the wilderness and never came back, the botanist who named plants and watched the stars, the rebel who gave them a bad time, the ranger who loved these mountains so much that perhaps, in the end, they kept him forever. Somewhere out there, under a sky unpolluted by city lights, the Milky Way stretches across the heavens like a river of ghosts. Paul used to set up his telescope for visitors, pointing at Saturn and Jupiter, at worlds that seemed impossibly far away. Now, he's the one who seems impossibly far away. A man who became a mystery, a name that became a question mark, the uniform that stayed empty. And the rocks remember everything, but the rocks don't talk. Paul Fugate vanished in the silence of an official uniform without leaving a single atom behind. A perfect absence. The wilderness took everything and gave nothing back. But there are cases where the forest decides to return something. Something that defies every law of physics, every logic of the human body. In the next chapter of Abnormal Remains, a man is found on an inaccessible peak. His hiking boots are laced tight, but his socks are gone. And what the rescue team saw when they reached him left them paralyzed with a fear they couldn't name. The case of James McGrogan, coming soon.